Before we begin this Microsoft digital event, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work throughout Australia, as well as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing this event today. We pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate their continuing connection to land, waters and community. Our reverence also extends to all First Nation and Indigenous peoples, as well as their ancestral lands.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another great episode of New Breakpoint. My name's Simon Waite. I'll be your host for today. We have an amazing show coming up, so please do stick around. If you've got any questions during the episode, please feel free to put them into the Q&A window where we'll either answer them during the episode, or if it's a bit of a meatier question or a question that we think is worth a bit of a discussion, we'll answer it during the live Q&A at the end of the episode. If you do want to share the episode with your community or your colleagues, keep an eye on your inbox. 2 to 3 days after today's air date, we'll share the details in an email to you. Any useful information we share during today's show, including links, will be in the show notes, which will pop into the Q&A window at the end. So let's get started. Today's guest, well, I'm joined by John Downs, who's a Senior FastTrack Engineer here at Microsoft. He's going to talk about a really cool topic. So you may have heard of Bicep, which is a really great DSL over the top of our Azure Resource Manager API, which gives you a really nice way to do infrastructure as code. But what you may not have seen is how to combine Bicep with automation using Azure pipelines or GitHub Actions as a way to automate the deployment of your infrastructure. So during today's episode, John's going to talk a bit about how you can achieve this, including a cool demo. Hi, John. Welcome to New Breakpoint.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me.
So today's episode, Bicep and automation using pipelines or GitHub Actions. I've used Bicep a bit, actually really love it, got used to it after having spent many years working with the ARM templates. Do you want to talk to us a bit about, the combination of Bicep and automation using pipelines and actions?
Yeah, sure. So Bicep, as you mentioned before, is a new language or newish language for defining and managing Azure resources using infrastructure as code. So previously, you mentioned ARM templates. Previously, ARM templates were the way to do that on Azure, or kind of the primary way to do that on Azure. And I think it's safe to say nobody really liked working with ARM templates. You ended up with these very, very long, difficult to read, difficult to write JSON files. There were all sorts of problems with just kind of having to do a lot of busy work to kind of keep them working and to manage them, and commenting was always difficult, and just a whole lot of things that just didn't really fit very well with how a lot of people wanted to do infrastructure as code. So about a year ago, Microsoft announced Bicep, which is this new language for working with infrastructure as code on Azure. And I think it's safe to say it's really changed the way the community works with Azure, and particularly with infrastructure as code. So it's got to the point now where I think there's really no reason to write any JSON ARM templates anymore. Bicep is really feature complete. There's still more work to do and adding more improvements, but it's at a really, really good space at the moment. It's supported for production, and it's something that we recommend that everybody go and look at. And when you've got Bicep, obviously you're writing this template file that explains kind of how you want your resources to look in your Azure environment. And you can be very expressive, and you can have a lot of different detail about your resource types and different configurations of resources. But what we really also try to help people understand is that writing your Bicep file is just the first part of your journey towards infrastructure as code. Because if you write Bicep files and you deploy them all manually, you're still getting some benefit. You're getting the ability to define all your resources in a single place and potentially collaborate with others using Git and those kinds of things. But when you add pipelines or GitHub Actions workflows on top of that, then you start to bring in automation. And that's where you really start to get the benefits of infrastructure as code. So you get a lot of benefits like speed, right? So if you make a change to a Bicep file and commit it and push it to your repo of choice, then if you've got your pipeline configured to do this, then it will automatically deploy maybe to a non-production environment or maybe all the way to production. And then you can very quickly tell if you've got any errors in it because you can add testing and so forth. But you can also then get a lot of value out of the resources you're adding a lot more quickly.
Yeah, no, look, it sounds amazing, John. I am conscious that I'm standing here grinning like a Cheshire cat and nodding in agreement with you. So would love for us to get into the demo. So how about I hand over to you for the stream, and I'll be back a little bit later for the Q&A.
Sounds good. All right. So we're going to be looking at two different products or two different kind of ways of doing pipelines. One is Azure Pipelines and one is GitHub Actions. They're actually both really, really good, really solid products for doing automation of your Bicep deployments. And you can choose whichever one you want to use, or which one you've got more familiarity with. Now, whichever way you go, ultimately a pipeline is really there to help you to describe the process that you need to follow to get your code, whatever form that is, to production, right? So it gives you a way to provide a workflow essentially, or a sequence of events, a sequence of steps that need to happen to get your code ready to go. So both Azure Pipelines and GitHub Actions both work with the YAML file format. And we'll have a look through a YAML file in a second and see how the pipeline definitions look. But I wanted to just quickly show a Bicep file first, in case you haven't seen this before. So this is the Bicep file that we'll be working with today. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time looking at this in detail, but I will quickly give you a tour of it and just kind of explain what it's doing roughly. I'm going to start down here where it starts with defining resources, and then we'll pick back up at the top. So what this Bicep file is doing is defining a website, and the website is using Azure App Service. So in Azure App Service, you define both an app, which is like the application, the website, and you also define a plan, which is the hosting infrastructure, the kind of the servers, the server farm that runs on. So in Bicep, we basically are defining these as two separate resources and then linking them together. So we can say here, this app runs on this app service plan. Now, if you're just skimming through the code here, hopefully it's pretty clear what this is doing, right? You can see it's just saying we're defining a resource. We're giving it this name here, which is called a symbolic name. This is just used inside our Bicep file to help us to refer to it. Then we can say it's of type Microsoft.web/server farms. It's got a version, which is the API version that we're using to interact with Azure for this particular resource type. And then it's got a bunch of properties. And you can see we do the same thing here for the App Service app as well. So I'm assuming that most people who've used Bicep will be familiar with this. If you're not, hopefully by just skimming through this, you can get a rough sense of what this is doing. And this Application Insights resource, similarly, we're defining another resource there, which is an instance of Application Insights, which we often use as part of our web application deployments. And we're also deploying a storage account. And that's another fairly simple resource type as well. Now, when you start working with pipelines and with infrastructure as code, you often need to be able to get information between different parts of your pipeline. And if you've got resources defined in Bicep, then you might want to provide information about those resources to your pipeline. So, for example, in this application or in this deployment, we need to get the host name, which is the web address essentially of our app service app, so that our pipeline might be able to use that to run an integration test or to hit the URL to verify that it's valid or something like that. So in Bicep, we can declare an output and then say that this output here, this output named app service app host name, which is a string, is set to the value of the app service's default host name. So by using these kinds of features like outputs, we can get data out of our Bicep file and into the rest of our pipeline really easily. And then up the top of our file, we've got data coming in. So we've got these parameters. So we've got a parameter to specify the location. That's the Azure region where these resources are deployed. An environment type. So one of the big benefits of pipelines is you can have the same definition that deploys both your dev, non-production, whatever test environments, as well as your production environment. So they all stay in sync. And it also creates this resource name suffix, which means that all of your Azure resources will have a unique name. Now, one of the really nice things about Bicep and the tooling for Bicep is that it really tries hard to find any issues in your Bicep file before you get too far with your deployment. And one of the features it uses is called the Bicep linter. And anytime it finds anything in your Bicep file that looks like it might not be quite right, the linter puts this yellow squiggly underline underneath it. Now, in this case, this is telling me that this parameter, the storage account name parameter, is not being used. And that's not necessarily a huge problem, but it's generally a bad idea to have parameters you don't need because it just makes it more complex to use your deployment or to use your Bicep for a file for a deployment. So I'm going to delete that. Okay, so now I've got a Bicep file that's deploying some resources. And the key thing that we want to look at now is how do we actually get this working in a pipeline. Now, a pipeline, all it's really doing is running the sequence of commands that you would run manually when you deploy something from your own local machine. So in this case, I'm actually going to deploy that Bicep file myself, just to kind of understand the process that this needs to go through. Now, this is a very, very simple Bicep file. So all I'm going to be doing is just running the Azure CLI to say AZ deployment group create, which is saying create a new resource group deployment to Azure. I'm going to say the template file is in the deploy folder, and it's called main.bicep. And it's going to the resource group named website manual. So I create that deployment, and this just helps me validate that the Bicep file is valid, as makes sense. And also by doing this, I can kind of understand the sequence of events so that when it comes time to put those into my pipeline definition, I have a good understanding of what actually needs to happen. So I'm going to let that run. While I do, I'm just going to commit that change that I made. So that change with that linter warning, I'm just going to say I've removed the unneeded parameter. Okay. And you can see that deployment that I just ran succeeded. So now I've deployed my Bicep file to a resource group. Now, that's not what I want to end up at, right? This is just the intermediate state that's helped me kind of test my Bicep file as valid. Now, what I want to do is look at Azure Pipelines definition. So Azure Pipelines, I'm going to close this now. So Azure Pipelines has a YAML file format that lets us, as I said, describe the process that we want to follow to get our code ideally all the way to production, or to at least complete whatever steps we need to do in our pipeline. Now, there's lots of different ways you can go about configuring a pipeline for Azure Pipelines in terms of there's these things called stages and jobs and steps. You can kind of mix and match them in different ways. I'm not going to get into that in a lot of detail right now, but I just want to kind of show the rough flow of how this works. So the first thing that we do here is run a lint job. And the linting is basically just running this Bicep command to say, are there any warnings on the file, right? So before we had that warning about that parameter, if we run this command, then those kinds of warnings would be picked up. And if there are any of those warnings, then that would actually fail our pipeline. But that's what we want, right? We want to any kinds of errors or mistakes or warnings to be surfaced early, and then for us to have to halt the pipeline and then decide how to deal with them, and then make any necessary changes or fixes, redeploy those, and then carry on through the pipeline. So the very first step in our pipeline is to lint our Bicep code. The next step is to run what we call pre-flight validation. So this is a process by which we say to Azure, if we were to deploy this Bicep file into this resource group, would it succeed? Now, to do this, we're using the Azure CLI. So we're running the AZ command right from within our Bicep file, within our pipeline file. And so the Azure CLI has the ability to run this validation process. Again, if there's any kind of problem with the Bicep file or with the deployment that the Bicep file will create, then the pipeline will stop. So the pipeline will tell us that something is wrong, and then we can continue later if we need to. And then the third part of our pipeline is to actually deploy. And again, we're using the Azure CLI for this. And this is basically the same command I just ran. So it's running the AZ deployment group create command to create a new deployment to a resource group. So there's 3 steps in here, right? So there's the initial step to run the lint, then validate, then deploy. Now, in a real Bicep deployment or in a real kind of production deployment, you'll probably have a lot more steps than this. You'll have a lot more steps to do testing, and you'll also be deploying across multiple environments. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but that's something that we've got a lot of help to provide on that as well. Okay, so now that we've looked through this pipeline definition, I'm actually going to push this. I've already created a Git repo that I'm working in, and I've actually created multiple upstreams for this. So I can actually push the same repo to both GitHub and Azure pipelines. That's not normal. You wouldn't normally have the same repo be built in two different ways, but just for demo purposes, that makes it a little bit easier. So now what I'm going to do is switch across to Azure DevOps. Now, I've pre-created an environment here, or a project for this demo. I've also pre-created something called a service connection. One of the things that can be a little bit complex when you work with pipelines is authentication. Every time I run the Bicep file deployment from my own machine, it's pretty clear that I'm the person running it, and Azure uses my own identity to be able to initiate that deployment. So if I'm allowed to deploy something, then my Bicep deployment will be allowed to do it. When you work with pipelines, it's a little bit more complicated because the pipeline runs unattended. There's no human that's triggering the pipeline to run. And so we have this thing called a service connection, which uses an Azure service principal behind the scenes to be able to authenticate the pipeline to Azure. Again, there's a lot more complexity here that I'm glossing over, and I'll provide some more detail on that a bit later on. So we've got our project here, and we haven't currently created a pipeline, so I'm going to just do that now. I've already created that pipeline definition file, so all I'm really doing now is registering that with Azure Pipelines. So I can say I've got an existing pipeline YAML file, and it's this one here, the Azure Pipelines file. And now I can say, okay, that's great, I want to run it. And I'll talk more about how pipelines run in a second. Okay, so that's going to take a minute to run. While that's running, I'm going to look at the equivalent pipeline definition or workflow definition for GitHub Actions. Now you can see here that we're basically going to do the exact same things, right? So we're running the bicep lint command, the bicep build command, which lints it. And you can see that the syntax is slightly different to what we had before, but it's pretty similar, right? It's the words are slightly different, and there's slightly different steps and so forth, but the overall flow is exactly the same. Then for the validate job, so we actually have to explicitly sign in, which we don't do for Azure Pipelines. But then there's a bit of a difference here in that instead of using the Azure CLI with GitHub Actions, there's actually a built-in action called arm-deploy, which will allow us to validate a bicep file. So there are a few differences between Azure Pipelines and GitHub Actions when we start working with these kinds of pipelines. But overall, you can do exactly the same things. It's just the way that you do it might be slightly different. And then if we look at the third job, that's the deploy job. Again, it signs in to Azure. Sorry, all these tooltips are popping up everywhere. And then it deploys the website, right? It deploys the bicep file. So even though the syntax is slightly different between the two, they're doing exactly the same things. These are essentially equivalent pipelines. Now, one of the things that will be coming to Azure Pipelines is the ability to run some of the native tasks to run bicep files. Currently, we can't do that, which is why we have to use the Azure CLI. And GitHub Actions, it has slightly better support for bicep today, but that will change over time. All right, so once again, I'm going to push this to GitHub. And I'll come back to that failure in a second, but I'll just quickly have a look in GitHub first. So now that I've pushed my changes, we can see the files in there. So our bicep file and our other files in there. I've also created a secret, which is a repository entity. It's a setting in the repository for our Azure credentials. So this is equivalent to a service connection in Azure Pipelines. It's the same kind of idea. It's a slightly different way of doing it. Now in the Actions tab, this is where I can see the Actions workflow that we just defined. And in this case, I don't actually have to register it. GitHub automatically realized it was there. Okay, so while that runs, I'll just have a look back at this, at our Azure Pipelines pipeline run. And we see there was actually the lint job succeeded. So if we click on this and look at the log, we can see that the linter ran successfully. That's good. That means the bicep file was valid and there were no warnings. But then there was an error when it came time to validate the bicep file. And if we look at the failed step there, and look at this line down here, which is a little bit hard to read, I'll put that into Visual Studio Code. We could do that's fine. What it's saying is the account toy website storage is already in another resource group in this subscription. Well, actually, there's a typo there that I need to tell the team about. So what that basically means is we've done something a little bit wrong in our Bicep file, where we're now trying to deploy multiple storage accounts with the same name. So let's have a look at our Bicep file and see if we can figure out what happened. So if I look at our Bicep file, we can look at our storage account, and I can see the problem here. Storage account name variable is currently hard-coded to toy website storage. It should be using the resource name suffix, which means that each environment that we deploy to, or each resource group we deploy to, will have a different name. Storage accounts have to all have unique names in Azure, and so if we try to deploy multiple storage accounts in different resource groups with the same name, we get this kind of error. So this is an easy fix. So I can just say, I want to use the resource name suffix. Actually, I'll remove that character because that's not valid for a storage account. In fact, I'll simplify this down to toy. So now that we've fixed that, hopefully, we can commit that change. And I'll push that change to Azure Pipelines and also to GitHub. I know I'm glossing over a few steps here, and I will get back to those, I promise. And if we look at GitHub Actions, then we can see here that the exact same thing failed. The validate failed, and that's not unexpected. We got the same error message there. So now that we've fixed that and pushed our changes, let's just have a quick look at our pipeline definition. So both of our pipeline definitions, our Azure Pipelines definition and our GitHub Actions workflow, both have what we call a trigger, which specifies when the pipeline should run. In this case, what we've said is anytime we push a change to the main branch, then the pipeline should start running. So that's a really useful thing to do when you're working in these kinds of simple repositories where you're just working directly against the main branch, or if you're doing something like trunk-based development. If you're doing more complex branching strategies, then you might want to tweak how this works a little bit. You can also specify other triggers to run as well. So you can run on schedules. So for example, doing nightly builds or nightly releases. And you can also do manual triggers as well. So you can just say, I just want to initiate this manually. So now that we've pushed that change, we can see that Azure Pipelines is starting to rerun our validation, or the whole pipeline and with the validation. And if we look at GitHub Actions, we can see that's running again as well. And this time GitHub Actions has already completed the validation successfully, and it's moved on to the deployment stage. So that's really good. That means that our template is valid and the deployment is valid, so therefore it can deploy them. Hopefully Azure Pipelines will succeed as well. Now, while we're waiting for that to finish, another thing just to be aware of as well is the infrastructure that actually runs our deployments isn't anything magic, right? Really, what Microsoft and GitHub are doing is running a whole pile of servers for us called agents for Azure Pipelines, or runners for GitHub Actions, that will basically let us borrow time from them to run little bits of our pipeline code. So when we're doing things like running these individual commands or these tasks, we are actually getting a lease essentially on an agent machine that GitHub or Microsoft is providing. It's initiated with all of our context, all of our Git repo and all of the other information it needs. It runs the code we've specified, and then it's torn down, right? It's thrown away. And so that means that we don't have to manage server infrastructure to be able to run pipelines. We're actually saying we're going to be using these, in this case, Ubuntu Linux machines that are provided by Microsoft and GitHub. So that's a really nice thing to do. It means you don't have to maintain a whole bunch of extra servers just to deploy things. All right, so we've seen that our GitHub pipeline has succeeded, our GitHub Actions workflow succeeded, and our Azure Pipelines pipeline is currently in progress. So hopefully that'll finish in a moment. Now, as I mentioned, we've really just kind of glossed over a lot of the detail here. There's a lot more conceptual understanding in terms of all these different components, so jobs and steps and stages and so forth, as well as how you actually put this together into a complex pipeline for real-world scenarios. So what I wanted to talk about before we finish up is some information that we've started to put together about how to do this, not just the mechanics of it, but how to do this really well, based on our experience ourselves with lots and lots of different customers doing lots of different types of deployments. So if you go to aka.ms/learn Bicep, that takes you to this page. So on Microsoft Learn, we've put together a ton of information about how to work with Bicep. And that includes the Bicep language, as well as Bicep inside deployment pipelines. If you're new to Bicep, if when I was showing that Bicep file before, if you didn't really understand what was going on, I suggest you start with parts 1 and 3, especially part 1. So these are actually complete courses on how Bicep works, all the details of the different language features and different features of Azure Resource Manager that let you understand all the different parts of Bicep and how you can use them for defining very complex resources. Once you've understood Bicep and once you've understood some of those other features, then you can decide which path you want to go down, if you want to go with Azure Pipelines or with GitHub Actions. And we've got equivalent content for both. And in both cases, again, we take you through from the absolute basics of how you build a very first deployment pipeline and using the kinds of techniques and things we've just talked about today. So, fairly basic pipeline that just does the absolute minimum deployment to a single environment, a single resource group, all the way through to how the authentication process works. I mentioned before that we use service connections and secrets in GitHub to deal with that. There's actually quite a lot that it's helpful to understand there to be able to understand how to diagnose when things go wrong. Testing, so that includes linting and validation that we just talked about, but also things like running little tests against your deployed resources to make sure they're actually valid and they're behaving the way that you expect them to. And then, of course, managing multiple environments, which is where you get so many benefits of infrastructure as code. So in that module, we actually talk through a lot of detail about if you're going to deploy the same Bicep file across multiple resources, or multiple resource groups or multiple subscriptions for different environments, how do you do that well? How do you manage parameters and the differences between the environments? How do you manage the fact that you're going to be running essentially the same steps? How do you avoid copying and pasting? And there's features in both GitHub Actions and Azure Pipelines to help you with that. And then we also talk about end-to-end deployment scenarios, which are if you're integrating Bicep into an existing pipeline, or you're creating a pipeline that needs to deploy both deploy both Bicep files and code. So, for example, a .NET or a Node or another web application. How do you put that all together into one pipeline so that it's doing your entire deployment all in one go? So we've really tried hard to explain kind of everything that you need to know about pipelines. We've also got some more content coming soon about pull requests and other things as well. All right. So I think now we can look back at our pipeline history and see, yep, sure enough, the Azure Pipelines run has now succeeded. So we've now linted, validated, and deployed a Bicep file from within our pipeline. And then we can also look at Azure just to kind of get a verification or a sanity check on our environment. So I've actually created 2 different resource groups here, one for the Azure pipeline to run, one for GitHub Actions. And if I look at those, we can see there's a bunch of resources in them. So those 4 resources we defined. And of course, in the GitHub Actions one, those same resources are there as well. So that's how pipelines work at a kind of a high level. I know I've glossed over a lot of information there, and pipelines can be quite complex to create, especially when you start getting to more sophisticated scenarios, or when you've got scenarios where you need to integrate applications and Bicep together, infrastructure and applications together. So what I really suggest is starting small, starting by creating a minimal pipeline that might just do one small thing. And then over time, build up the complexity. Don't try and do too much at once. Just build up piece by piece. And hopefully the resources we put together on Microsoft Learn will help you to understand how to do that. So I think with that, I'll hand back to Simon.
Awesome demo, John. Thanks a lot for that. Seeing the differences between pipelines and actions. I mean, there are some similarities underneath the covers there, but definitely good to get an overview of using those two platforms to do your infrastructure deployment automation using Bicep. I did have a couple of questions for you, and we'll go through those first, and then we'll have a live session with John after this. But it's probably one of the top of mind questions for people that are using GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps for a range of different things. But I guess it's just as equally applicable in this case as well. When you look at Actions versus Azure pipelines, which one of the two platforms do you think is the preferred one, or is there a preferred one, or are they the same?
Yeah, they're not exactly the same. There are some differences between them, but I'd say broadly speaking, they're very, very similar. And I've never really come across a situation where I just couldn't do something in one that I could do in another. So you can, to a certain extent, if you're already using a particular tool, if you're already using Azure DevOps or you're already using GitHub, it probably makes sense to stay in the world that you're in today. Mm-hmm. But having said that, if you're new to both of these tools, or you're new to this whole environment, I think you're probably going to find that over time, GitHub Actions is going to be the place that's going to have the most ongoing development in the next little while. There's still active work going on Azure Pipelines as well, but I think GitHub Actions is where our focus is. And so I'd probably be looking at GitHub Actions if you don't have a preference. But having said that, if you're already on Azure Pipelines or you've started down that path, you don't need to reverse course and switch just yet. I think there's going to be plenty of time to work with Azure Pipelines and do what you need to do. But I think over time, it's probably going to become GitHub Actions. We'll just get a few little features and changes that'll make it a little bit more compelling.
Well, certainly the workflow definitions now for Actions and the YAML definitions for Azure Pipelines, there's a high degree of similarity between those two. So I think if you are working with pipelines, probably taking a preference to working with the YAML definitions is probably a good idea at this point, particularly if you've been working with the classic graphical designer type experience, because it'll make that transition to GitHub Actions at some future point a much simpler journey to make. But as you said, if you've invested time in building expertise in pipelines, absolutely you should stick with it. It's not a lost investment by spending time working with that platform.
As one example of a feature that's kind of coming to GitHub Actions that I don't think is there in Azure Pipelines just yet. We've introduced a new authentication process for GitHub Actions that isn't available for Azure Pipelines. So that essentially lets you kind of create credential-free authentication for your GitHub Actions workflows. So that's really nice. It's a bit like managed identities in Azure. You don't have to manage credentials. It's the same kind of idea for GitHub Actions. So if you're working in GitHub Actions, you get some of those kinds of benefits, or you will do when that goes publicly released.
Awesome. The other question I have, and this is also a fairly common one as well, right? So I think the demos that you ran through today, the scenarios you had, were kind of deploying infrastructure into pre-existing Azure subscriptions. Maybe those subscriptions have had predefined policies applied to them already. I do see a lot of questions around, if I can automate those kind of sub-resource types or intra-subscription resource types, can I go to the level of automating the deployment of Azure subscriptions, Azure policy, potentially even user identities and those sorts of things as part of that? Is that something that it's possible to achieve with Bicep?
It is, yeah. So I guess there's two parts to that. One is it possible to achieve in Bicep, and is it possible to do with pipelines? So firstly, with Bicep, yes, it absolutely is. So we've actually got a whole Learn module just about this thing called deployed resources to subscriptions, management groups, and tenants, which not only includes how you deploy things like Azure policy and role definitions and those kinds of things, but also you can actually use those to create resource groups, to create subscriptions and so forth. I can actually show you a quick example of how that works in Bicep.
Awesome. Great.
So there's just in this Bicep file here, there's a policy definition, a policy assignment. It creates a resource group, and then it creates some other stuff as well. You can also use Bicep to create Azure subscriptions too. So all of that is possible. I'd say there's a little bit of kind of a conceptual understanding that it's worth coming in with before you go too far down that path. So that's where this Learn module really helps to just kind of understand a little bit about the Azure resource hierarchy and all the different kind of points at which you can deploy things and how some of that works. So have a look through that Learn module to understand that. Once you've done that, then the next step is deploying it from a pipeline. You absolutely can deploy all of this from a pipeline, but it's probably worth just noting that when you start working with things like creating resource groups or creating subscriptions, you often need quite high permissions to do that. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a challenge to figure out how you do that for your pipeline, how you give it permissions in the right kind of way. So again, we've got some guidance on that through the docs, but that's probably the one call that I just make. Is it is possible, but just want to make sure you understand what you're doing.
Yeah, you probably don't want to have a highly privileged user account being able to execute all of your actions or all of your deployments. Is something that I've seen a lot is people just default to, particularly intra-subscription, having an owner-level identity doing those deployments, which sounds like a nice idea and is really simple, but actually ultimately is probably counter to best practice because your blast radius at that point for something going wrong is quite substantial. So I think that's probably the takeaway for me is really when you start thinking about infrastructure automation, a big part of that is limiting the ability for a deployment to have unintended consequences on resources that aren't really being, deployed as part of this.
That's right.
I'm sure that's covered in the, that documentation you were just mentioning.
It is, yeah. So we actually talk quite a lot about things like approvals, which is really important when you're working with those kinds of highly privileged access. So you can actually have a human have to verify exactly what's going to be deployed before the pipeline continues to deploy it, for example. So if you're going to be doing anything that's highly privileged, then it's worth thinking about those kinds of controls and making sure that you've got your pipeline secured as well, because you don't want that to become your point of weakness.
Yep, absolutely. Look, John, thank you very much for the demo and the content today. I know I've learned, again, a lot. I love doing these shows because, the folks we have on are far better at something than I am, and I always get a chance to learn. Hopefully the audience has as well. I know we've had plenty of interesting questions. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop over to a live Q&A, and John will be joining us for that. So please do stick around. John, thanks a lot for joining us, and I'll see you in a moment.
Thanks, Simon.